Tonight, we're learning new details in the death of legendary actor Gene Hackman.
Deaths of Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman and his wife, whose bodies were found in their Santa Fe home.
1425 Old Sunset Trail, where Gene Hackman, 95, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 65, and a dog were found deceased.
On the afternoon of February 26, 2025, a maintenance worker named Jesse Kessler walked up to a house outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, the way he had 100 times before. He'd worked as a personal contractor for the couple who lived there for 16 years. He knew the property, knew the routine, knew that something about that day was wrong before he even reached the door. When no one answered, he and a colleague, Roland Lobegay, went inside. What they found would trigger a national investigation, a flood of speculation, and one of the strangest, saddest timelines in recent memory, the story of how a 95-year-old Oscar winner and his wife came to die, alone, in a house that no one checked on for weeks. This is not a story about secret tunnels or hidden chambers. There aren't any. What actually happened is stranger than that, in a much quieter way, and honestly more troubling, because it could happen to almost anyone. Let's start with who they were. Gene Hackman was, by any measure, one of the defining American actors of the last 60 years. He won 2 Academy Awards, Best Actor for The French Connection in 1972, and Best Supporting Actor for Unforgiven in 1993. In between, he built a career most actors would consider miraculous. Bonnie and Clyde, The Conversation, Superman, Hoosiers, Crimson Tide, Enemy of the State. He played cops, villains, coaches, presidents, and con men, and he did it all with a kind of unglamorous intensity that made him one of the most respected character actors of his generation. And then in the early 2000s, after Welcome to Mooseport in 2004, he simply stopped. He walked away from Hollywood entirely and never made another film. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place he'd loved for years, and built a quiet life there with his second wife, Betsy Arakawa. Arakawa was a classical pianist born in Hawaii who had studied at the University of Southern California. She met Hackman in the mid-1980s while working at a California gym, and they married in 1991. In retirement, Hackman devoted himself to painting and writing novels, several of them historical fiction, far away from the industry that made him famous. Arakawa managed their life together, and by most accounts, the two of them were devoted to each other for nearly 40 years. They weren't hermits in the dramatic sense people sometimes imagine. They were simply private. Santa Fe locals have described a couple who kept to themselves but were polite, ordinary neighbors, the kind of low-key retirement that plenty of people, especially very famous ones, actively seek out. There was no elaborate security apparatus, no army of silent staff. There was a house, a life, and eventually illness. Here's where the story actually turns dark. Not with a mystery villain, but with the plain, brutal math of aging and isolation. By February 2025, Hackman was 95 years old. He had a long history of serious heart disease, multiple heart procedures, previous heart attacks, an aortic valve replacement, and a pacemaker that had been placed back in April 2019. He also had advanced Alzheimer's disease, something that had not been publicly disclosed before his death. Arakawa, 65, was by all appearances in good health and functioning as his primary caregiver. In early February, something in the household shifted. Investigators later found that Arakawa had reached out to Santa Fe medical concierge service called Cloudberry Health a couple of weeks before her death, asking about scheduling an echocardiogram for her husband. She made an appointment for herself around the same time, unrelated to any respiratory issue, but 2 days beforehand, she called to cancel it, explaining that her husband wasn't well. Then on February 12th, she called the clinic again, this time asking about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, treatment that involves breathing pure oxygen in a pressurized chamber. She mentioned feeling congested herself, but nothing that sounded urgent or alarming to the person she spoke with. That call on February 12th would turn out to be one of the last confirmed traces of Betsy Arakawa's life. Investigators, piecing together her phone records and computer activity, found that she had also searched online in the days prior for symptoms tied to COVID, the flu, dizziness, and nosebleeds. On February 11th, she emailed her massage therapist, mentioning that Hackman had taken a COVID test after showing flu-like symptoms. She was seen out running errands at day 2, a grocery store, a CVS, a pet food store, the small, unremarkable rhythm of someone's Tuesday. And then, based on everything investigators could reconstruct, she never appeared in public again. Medical examiners would later determine that Arakawa died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a severe and fortunately rare respiratory illness. Hantavirus is carried by rodents, particularly deer mice, which are common throughout New Mexico. Human infections are uncommon, but when they happen, they're serious. Over the past 50 years, the state has recorded roughly 136 cases, and nearly half of them proved fatal. The illness starts like the flu: fever, muscle aches, coughing, and it can escalate with terrifying speed. Once breathing difficulty sets in, a person can die within 24 to 48 hours without immediate medical treatment. It does not spread from person to person. Hackman himself tested negative for it. Investigators noted that while the house itself showed a low risk of rodent exposure, comparable to any well-kept home in the region, there were signs of rodent activity in other structures on the property. It's likely Arakawa was infected somewhere on the grounds without ever knowing it, mistaking the early symptoms for a cold or a mild flu, the same way almost anyone would. The New Mexico Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Heather Jarrell, said investigators believe Arakawa most likely died on February 12th, the same day of her last documented phone call. That means that for roughly a week afterward, Gene Hackman remained alone in that house with his wife's body and no outside contact. This is the detail that makes the story genuinely haunting, and it doesn't require any embellishment. Due to his advanced Alzheimer's disease, it's entirely possible. Investigators said it was quite possible, when directly asked, that Hackman did not fully register that his wife had died. He may not have understood what had happened or been able to act on it even if some part of him did. Data pulled from his pacemaker showed his last recorded heart activity on February 17th or 18th, meaning he likely died 6 or 7 days after his wife did, alone, disoriented, in a house that had gone silent around him. When deputies finally arrived on February 26th, they found Hackman in what's believed to be the home's mudroom. He appeared to have fallen suddenly. He was found wearing sweatpants, a long-sleeve shirt, and slippers, ordinary clothes for an ordinary day that never came. Arakawa was found in a bathroom near the front door, also in sweatpants and a sweatshirt with the door open. Near her body was an open prescription bottle with pills scattered on the countertop, later confirmed to be thyroid medication she'd been taking exactly as prescribed, unrelated to her death. One of the couple's 3 dogs was also found dead in a crate near Arakawa. The other 2 dogs were alive and healthy. Both bodies showed signs of decomposition consistent with the time that had passed, bloating, and in Arakawa's case, mummification of her hands and feet, a preservation process that can occur naturally depending on humidity and airflow conditions. Investigators found no evidence of external trauma on either of them. It's worth pausing on that because in the early hours of the case, before any of this was understood, the lack of an obvious explanation for 2 people dying days apart in a locked, alarmed house understandably triggered alarm bells. The initial search warrant affidavit described the circumstances as suspicious enough in nature to require a thorough search and investigation, language that, taken out of context, fed a wave of online speculation about foul play, gas leaks, poisoning, even elaborate conspiracy theories. It's the kind of boilerplate legal language investigators use any time a death isn't immediately, obviously explainable, not an admission that something sinister was afoot, but a procedural necessity before ruling anything out. And investigators did rule things out carefully. The New Mexico Gas Company inspected the property and issued 5 so-called red tags, minor safety flags, including 1 minuscule gas leak from a stove burner, but confirmed none of them involved a lethal amount of gas or contributed to either death. Santa Fe Fire Department personnel tested specifically for carbon monoxide and found no leak and no elevated readings. When Hackman's toxicology results came back, his carbon monoxide saturation was under 5%, well within the normal range for someone who'd never been exposed. There was no poisoning. There was no gas leak. There was no trauma. There was, in the end, exactly what the coroner said there was: an old man's failing heart and a woman's unlucky exposure to a virus carried by rodents that are simply part of life in rural New Mexico. Hackman's own toxicology results, released as part of the final autopsy report in April, showed no alcohol and no intoxicating drugs in his system. He did have a small trace of acetone, a chemical marker that shows up when a body has gone without food for an extended period, consistent, the medical examiner said, with prolonged fasting. There was no dehydration. It paints a picture, again without needing any embellishment, of a man whose body was simply shutting down over the course of days, likely with no one around to notice or help. The full picture of Gene Hackman's health, once the autopsy was released, was sobering. He'd suffered multiple documented heart attacks in the past. He had severe atherosclerotic and hypertensive cardiovascular disease. He'd had coronary artery stents placed along with a bypass graft and an earlier aortic valve replacement. His pacemaker, implanted in 2019, recorded an abnormal heart rhythm on February 17th, the day investigators believe he most likely died. And an examination of his brain tissue confirmed advanced-stage Alzheimer's disease, something that had never been part of his public story before. That last detail reframes almost everything about those final days. This wasn't a case of a healthy, alert 95-year-old choosing, for some dark or secretive reason, to stay silent in a house with his wife's body. It appears to be something far more common and far sadder. A man in serious cognitive decline, dependent on his wife for daily care, who may have simply been unable to process what had happened to her, and who then, days later, succumbed to the same kind of cardiac event that had already threatened his life multiple times before. The investigation continued for weeks after the bodies were found, partly because reconstructing an exact timeline for two people who died days apart with no witnesses required painstaking work. Investigators pulled phone records, email data, and browser history. They interviewed the couple's medical concierge service. They cross-referenced pacemaker telemetry with known dates of contact. Sheriff Adon Mendoza and the medical examiner's office held multiple press briefings as new pieces came in, updating the presumed dates of death as better data arrived, first estimating Arakawa's last known activity around February 11th, then refining it to February 12th based on the phone records from Cloudberry Health. There was also a legal fight tied to the investigation, though it had nothing to do with any cover-up. The Hackman estate petitioned a New Mexico judge to block the release of sensitive investigative material altogether, citing the family's right to privacy. Santa Fe District Court Judge Matthew Wilson ultimately ruled that most investigative records, autopsy reports, toxicology results, photographs from inside the home, could be released to the public since they're generally considered public record under state law. But he drew a clear line. No images or video depicting either body could be released, and any photos or footage that had captured them, including the family dog that died in the home, had to be blurred or withheld. It was a narrow, humane compromise, public accountability for how the investigation was conducted, without turning two people's final, undignified moments into spectacle. Health officials also followed up on the rodent question, since it was central to understanding how Arakawa contracted hantavirus in the first place. They found dead rodents, droppings, and nesting materials scattered across parts of the property, mainly in outbuildings and structures separate from a main house, which itself showed no signs of infestation. It's a reminder of how easily this kind of exposure can happen in the American Southwest, even to people with resources, even in well-maintained homes. Hantavirus doesn't discriminate by wealth or fame. It lives in barns, sheds, garages, cabins, anywhere deer mice nest, and a single exposure, sometimes just breathing in dust stirred up from old droppings, is enough. By the time the medical examiner's office held its final press conference in early March and later released the complete autopsy reports in April, the picture had fully come into focus, and it was a picture free of intrigue. Two natural deaths days apart caused by two unrelated conditions, compounded by isolation, and by the particular cruelty of one partner's mind no longer being able to fully register the loss of the other. It's worth sitting with why this story captured so much attention in the first place, beyond Hackman's fame. There's something in it that resonates uncomfortably with a much broader, much more common reality. The quiet crisis of elderly couples living far from family, caring for each other as their health declines, with no formal support system checking in. Betsy Arakawa was, by every account, Gene Hackman's primary caregiver in his final years, managing his medical appointments, monitoring his declining health, holding together the daily logistics of caring for a 95-year-old man with serious heart disease and worsening dementia. When she became sick herself, there was no one else positioned to step in. No visiting nurse, no adult child checking in that week, no neighbor who happened to notice the mail piling up sooner. The very privacy that had defined their retirement, the thing that let them live exactly as they wanted for 2 decades, may have also been the thing that left no safety net in place when it mattered most. That's not a criticism of how they chose to live. Plenty of people, especially those who spent their working lives extremely visible, choose privacy in retirement precisely because it lets them exist as themselves rather than as a public performance. Hackman earned that, but the case has become, whether anyone intended it to or not, a kind of quiet public health footnote about what happens when caregiving arrangements, even loving, decades-long ones, have no backup plan built in. Friends and former colleagues who spoke about Hackman after his death remembered him less as the imposing, often intense screen presence audiences knew from The French Connection or Unforgiven, and more as someone who'd found real peace in Santa Fe. He painted. He wrote novels. He kept mostly to himself, but not out of bitterness, by most accounts, simply because he'd already given the public 40 years of himself on screen and felt entitled to the rest. Arakawa, for her part, was remembered as devoted, private, and fiercely protective of the life they'd built together, a former concert pianist who'd traded the stage for a quieter kind of partnership.